I am thrilled to be here with among many new friends, all of whom I believe support the same things that I have for my entire adult life been advocating for, and that is to empower families to make the right choices for their children's education. And I know we're going to talk about my book, but I've recently written a book that has given me the introduction to a lot of audiences like you to be able to talk further about these ideas, some of the experiences that were gained while I was in Washington, but a lot of the history that has been behind the move toward education freedom and the moment that we're in today, which I believe is one of great momentum and one that we really need to capitalize on for the sake of the kids who really need it the most. So I'm excited for our conversation and ready to go.
Now, I've been reading your book, and a wonderful book it is too. I noticed there are many copies in the room. It tells some wonderful stories. It talks about how you became the education secretary to begin with. There's this wonderful moment when, like millions of Americans, you woke up very pleasantly surprised to discover that Donald Trump was president. You then talk in your book this wonderful story about how you got this email from Jeb Bush, which you didn't look at for a few days, and you kind of ended up becoming education secretary. Talk us through, how did you actually become education secretary?
Well, actually, the morning after the election in 2016, I was headed early to Indiana for a series of meetings with legislators there around education policy and advancing education freedom there. And so I had gone to bed before the election was decided on Tuesday night. And so when I wakened, I was very happily surprised to see that President Trump had been named president-elect. And it was actually that day while I was traveling to Indiana, I was on my computer and I got this one-sentence email from Jeb Bush, who's been a longtime friend and fellow warrior in the education freedom movement. And the email said, "Would you ever consider being Secretary of Education?" That was it. And I have to admit, when I read that sentence, that thought had never before crossed my mind. So it was kind of like a startling situation. And I was traveling with a colleague with whom I'd worked on education freedom stuff for a long time, showed it to him, and we both kind of chuckled about it, and then I forgot about it for the day. And of course wouldn't have responded until I'd had a chance to think about it a little bit more and share it with my husband and make sure he didn't, say, "Don't even think about it." I actually came back and said, "Here's this email from Jeb, and here's what I think my response is going to be." And it was, I literally have never thought about it before, but if the opportunity ever arose, how could I not consider it? And my husband, Dick, said, "That's exactly what I thought you would say, and that's great." So that set off a very short chain of events. This was Wednesday, the day after the election. And it was, less than a week and a half later that then President-elect Trump called me on the phone and said, "You're going to make a great education secretary." So but that's all in the book, all the nuances in between there.
Wonderful. It's a wonderful story. Thank you. Now, also reading your book, what's really striking is just how much you've had to put up with. You've been absolutely vilified by the forces of no change, by people who are happy with mediocrity. You could have lived a quiet life, but you don't. You travel tirelessly around the country speaking on these issues. Where does this come from? Was there a moment when you suddenly thought, "I want to dedicate my life to this"?
Well, my work in education really developed when my oldest son, who's just about 41, was going to start kindergarten. And Dick and I knew we were going to be able to send our children wherever we thought was best for them. So I was looking around West Michigan, where we live, for all the options to consider. And in the process of doing that, I found a wonderful little Christian school in the heart of our city that was serving the students from that, or the families from that area, most of whom were low income, most of whom were minority students. And while we didn't end up sending Rick to that school, I got involved there as a volunteer. Very quickly realizing, and I guess fully understanding in a new way, just how unjust our financing and our policies were around education. Because for every family that had a child in that school, there were probably 10 or 20 other families in that neighborhood, or in that area, that would have loved to have their child in the school like the Potter's House. And so my volunteerism there really led me into much more advocacy work. At the same time, I was very politically involved. I served in every role in the Republican Party in Michigan, including, as I think Cal mentioned in the introduction, as a state party chair for 6 years. And so politics were something very familiar to me. And the more I got involved on the education policy side, the more I realized that it was going to take politics and political muscle to really make change. And so the book goes into all of the background on that. But really, I think we can attribute a lot of the successes in education freedom policies at the state level to when we introduced the political piece of it to the equation and said there's going to be accountability here. And if you don't support this, you might not win your next election. And that has been very effective in the states in which we worked.
We're going to get into the book in a moment with some questions about some of the ideas in it. But before we do that, am I allowed to ask, what was Donald Trump like? What was it like working for him?
Well, he was, from my perspective, a great boss because education was not in his top, 3 to 5 issues that he was focused on. So he gave me and my team a lot of latitude to do the work that we needed to do. We knew, his positions. We had the marching orders, and frankly, that was one of the things that really I ultimately ended up supporting him around. Was he was the first presidential candidate in my lifetime to advocate for school choice or education freedom. And so he really was a very hands-off boss from that perspective. And it was really, for the most part, a very great experience and I came from a place and a position where I haven't had too many bosses before. I've had boards to be responsible to, but not a lot of bosses. And so he was a good one in that regard. And there were plenty of little vignettes and stories that I could tell if there was a specific
please,
idea.
yes.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Nate, any ideas which one that would be? Oh, I'm thinking of one. So we were, one evening, the cabinet members had been invited to the White House to watch a film in the little theater in the White House. And this was a film that had been made by one of President Trump's friends. That friend was there, and they were chatting afterwards, and Dick and I came down out of the theater to exit, and President Trump, this particular filmmaker was also a father whose son had been wrongfully accused I think it was his son or a very close friend, had been part of the Duke lacrosse team that had been wrongfully accused in a Title IX issue. And that triggered in President Trump's mind that whole situation, knowing that I was in the midst of going through the rulemaking around Title IX. And so he just asked, how's that going? And I said, we're coming along. We're going to come out with a very strong rule, as you know, Mr. President. And then he stopped and he looked at Dick and he looked back at me and he looked back at Dick and he said, she's tough. She's tougher than you and me.
Wonderful. Your book, Hostages No More, could you explain the title? Talk a little bit about the thinking there.
Certainly. It's an admittedly provocative title, Hostages No More, but it's a direct reference to a quote that was made by Horace Mann. Horace Mann is commonly known as the father of our K-12 education system, brought to the United States from Prussia in approximately 1875. At that time, Horace Mann said that educators are entitled to look upon parents as having given hostages to our cause. Think about that. And then think about how many ways parents have realized their children have been held hostage to causes that may be very different than their own cause for their own child, especially coming into focus during COVID. And we'll, I know, talk more about that. But it really is about freeing them from being hostage to a government-run, single, focus, a one-size-fits-all system. And another little piece about Horace Mann, which is expounded upon in the book, but it's interesting to think about the fact that Horace Mann died 20 years before Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. Now, when you think about that, and you think about how much our ability to communicate with one another has changed since that first phone call, and how little a child's experience of K-12 education has changed since then, it really does kind of, I think, put things into focus in a whole new way.
So when you talk about the education system in America as being un-American, you're basically saying we've imported a late 19th century Prussian system.
Well, we did in fact do that, and it was, it was probably, I know it was well-intentioned, it was probably the right thing at that time as we were entering the industrial age, where you were, the plan was to put kids in one end of the system and have them all turn out the other end, doing the exact same things, knowing the same things, being essentially very similar and similarly prepared to one another. But that's not what the world needs today, and that's not what kids need. It's a very different world today, and we need to be fostering the kind of creativity and innate talent that every child has, and doing that, recognizing it's going to take different ways and different approaches to unleash and unlock all of that, not keep forcing them into a one-size-fits-all, top-down, top-driven system.
In Washington, D.C., there's a great alphabet soup of bureaucracy, organizations and institutions that certainly don't get a mention in the Constitution, which have kind of been created and assumed powers that were never intended. Would you include the Department of Education in that? Should we even have a Department of Education at a federal level?
I don't believe we should, and in fact, I've been often asked, would you ever consider going back as Secretary of Education? I said I would go under two circumstances. The first would be that we had an environment and we had a Congress ready to pass a bill that would add rocket fuel to education freedom programs in states. So we introduced, while in office, a bill to create a federal tax credit. A tax credit, not a program, not another department, simply a mechanism for individuals like any of us in this room to redirect a small portion of our federal tax bill directly into scholarship programs in our states or in someone else's state, wherever we chose, but to really come alongside what states are doing. So that would be the first provision. The second would be with a mission to shut down the Department of Education. I believe that's what should happen. And, it was, the Department of Education was not founded until 1979. It was a payoff that Jimmy Carter made to the teachers' unions for having endorsed him for president in 1976, the first time the teachers' unions endorsed a presidential candidate. So the payoff was a federal Department of Education. Any education matters had before been handled through it was HHS. No, it was HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare. But then the Department of Education was founded. In fact, the head of the cabinet secretary for HEW at the time, Joseph Califano, said, "I do not believe a Department of Education, a federal Department of Education is called for. Basically, this is a state's issue and it should be left to the states." So even his own party members were saying this is not the right thing. But it was founded with the goal of closing the achievement gap between the top performers and the lowest performers. Over $1 trillion later at the federal level alone, spent to specifically with that goal in mind, not only have our achievement gaps not narrowed one little bit, they've actually widened by almost every measure. So you have to ask yourself, why would you continue doing the same thing with more and more and more taxpayer resources and expect different results? I would argue if Congress wants to spend money on kids' education, they should send it directly to families through a vehicle like the tax credit, a tax credit at the federal level. It should be sent directly to the families who need it most to do just that, to figure out where their child's deficits are going to be best made up and best closed.
It's very tempting for conservatives to think that everything that goes wrong in DC and at a federal level must be down to those Democrats. But actually, what's interesting reading your book is how often, despite having a conservative in office, you're having these tremendous fights with your own department, with this bureaucratic blob. Can you tell us about some of those struggles you had and where you got resistance even from supposedly your own side?
Sure. Well, as you all know, every federal agency has a permanent bureaucracy, and to the largest extent, and particularly in the Department of Education, that permanent bureaucracy is very much tilted toward the left, shall we say. And so everything that we tried to do, or everything that we did and accomplished internally at the Department of Education, was most often met with absolute resistance. Everything was slow-walked. Everything was made vastly more difficult than it ever should have been. And for someone who came from the private sector, this was particularly frustrating, because the simplest of things that should have taken, 5 minutes or 5 hours to get done actually ended up taking 5 weeks or 5 months or maybe even longer. And so this bureaucracy just continues to go from administration to administration, and we're ultimately all ill-served by the way that it does not allow those who are in the executive branch, the president and a duly elected to be the executive, to actually accomplish much of their agenda, because there is so much inherent opposition and resistance that is a part of the permanent bureaucracy.
Now, when COVID came along, there was this almost irrational hysteria and people demanding lockdowns, politicians demanding lockdowns. You're very critical of that decision. How much damage did that have on education? Was it really one of the worst decisions ever made?
The lockdowns during COVID and the extended lockdowns, it was important when we first knew that this was a very big question mark and did not know what the longer term realities were going to be. It was appropriate for 2 to 4 weeks. But beyond that, we started to know that kids were not the spreaders, kids were not the ones getting it, kids were not at risk in ways that elderly individuals or ones with underlying conditions were. And instead of figuring out how we're going to best continue to make sure all kids are learning, the system, headed by the teachers' unions and all of the allies, all of the alphabet soup organizations, kept figuring out ways to extend the lockdowns, particularly in large urban areas. And even today, we're looking at the city of Los Angeles that was closed down the longest. Now the teachers are on strike again in sympathy with the service workers there. And it's the children in that district that are suffering the most. I mean, the learning loss that has occurred because of this is immeasurable in many ways, and I don't think we're going to begin to know the full impact of that for many years, particularly if policies aren't changed to actually change the dynamic and introduce education freedom into it.
You sort of alluded to it when you talked about the role of some of the unions in with regard to COVID. But how big a problem in this fight are unions?
Well, they're the core. I mean, they're the top of the peak of the problem, because they're the ones that basically collude with all of the other organizations to protect the status quo. I mean, think about it. They collect the dues, basically from all of us taxpayers. They collect the dues via teachers and all of the support staff, and then they use those union dues to support candidates who will pledge to do their bidding. And 99.7% of all the funds that they distribute out, the reported funds, go to Democrats who say, we're going to pledge to carry out your agenda. And so it becomes a vicious circle. And so it's politicians as well. It's elected officials who are part of this, protection of a failed system for too many kids, and who continue to really hold them hostage, as my book title says, hold them hostage if you don't have the resources or the means to do something different. It really is a very frustrating dynamic, and one that I think has begun to become more revealed again through the realities of COVID. I believe they've overplayed their hand in many circumstances, and the extended lockdowns, and then now the revelation around curriculums that are abhorrent to many families' values, or ones that in the distance learning were not even close to being robust enough to a family's expectations. So it really has revealed behind the curtain, so to speak, and there's in many cases no there there.
In many districts, in many states across America, you have this problem of basically the education budget being spent in the interests of administrators and the payroll rather than the children in the classroom. But if that's the bad story, the really exciting story is we're starting to see real change. I would almost call it if not a revolution, then the beginnings of a revolution. We saw in West Virginia an incredibly enlightened policy of ESAs, and we can explain what those are. Arizona followed suit, and then the neighbors across the river in Arkansas have brought in, I don't know about you, but Sarah Huckabee Sanders has done this most amazing program of reform with a fully fledged universal ESA. Why is this happening, and why now?
Well, I believe it's happening because, for one thing, many have toiled, and many in this room have toiled for a long time to continue to advocate for education freedom in from different respects and different perspectives. But the realities of COVID brought into very clear sight the many failings of the system that many of us have seen for decades, because parents had a front row seat to see what was happening as their children were distance learning in their living room or their kitchen, and they were able to eavesdrop on what was going on in the classroom, and in many cases they were appalled by what they saw, and so they've found their voices. And it's many parents who thought their children were in a good school, because after all, they'd moved to that suburb and paid more for that house to be living in a good school district, and then that school failed them. And so this has really helped parents across the country and grandparents find their voices and demand different. So the notion that instead of sending more and more money to a system, we should attach the dollars that are designated for that child to that child. And I have often used the metaphor of a backpack. You send a kid off to school every day with the things they need for the day in the backpack. Metaphorically, we should attach those dollars that are already being spent on that child through a system, attach those to that child's backpack and allow that family to make that choice of where that child goes to learn.
You talk in the book about the parental awakening, and it's clearly not just COVID that's prompted this. Do you think it's also partly that parents are now more aware of some of the abhorrent things that are being taught?
Oh, absolutely. And I do think that it was COVID that really helped reveal them, because I start out in the book talking about the Virginia governor's race and how Glenn Youngkin was able to really capitalize on a faux pas, what many of us thought was just a faux pas that would have been cleaned up by Terry McAuliffe, the former governor and then gubernatorial candidate, who said basically, I don't think parents should be involved in what goes on in a kid's school. And then he didn't back down on that. I mean, that was laying down the gauntlet, and parents reacted to that, rightfully so. And then they started to discover more and more things that had been going on. The Loudoun County is kind of a microcosm of what's happening all over the country. As you hear just abhorrent stories about, young, early elementary school children being, drawn into sexualized materials in ways that parents, if they had known it before, would have put their foot down and taken their kids out and done something different. So there's been a whole variety of things: critical race theory, reverse racism. There's wokeism. You name it. There's all kinds of ideological creep that I would argue has been there for a long time and has been growing, but it has been revealed in ways that nobody had anticipated. And I would attribute much of that to the downstream implications of COVID.
Looking across at what Arkansas has done, Arkansas is in a way very similar to Mississippi. Maybe I should be a bit careful about saying that, but in many ways they're similar. They both got a delta, they both got very similar demographics, very similar size. And almost out of the blue, Sarah Huckabee Sanders has done what every state I think should do. What's stopping us from doing that in Mississippi? What do you think we need to do? What are these supposedly insurmountable obstacles that she's overcome that we haven't tried to overcome here?
Well, Sarah went in with an agenda and with a plan to do exactly what she did. And I had the privilege of working with her often when she was at the White House, and we had many conversations about this topic in particular. At that time, not speculating she would run for governor in Arkansas, but not knowing for sure that she would. But I know she went there with the goal of right out of the gate, bringing the reforms forward that she knew has to happen for kids in Arkansas. And what it takes is that leadership and just the will to overcome the obstacles and the opposition that is very entrenched. And we know that is resident in every state in this country. So every state that's made progress toward education freedom, they've had to talk it through and just beat down the predictable arguments against doing something in this direction. All of the arguments about hurting public schools and draining money away and all of that has been totally debunked by the Florida example. Florida has had school choice, education freedom for 20 years, and they've continued to build on it term after term after term. And there have been dozens of studies that have gone after every one of these different arguments, and each one, it demonstrates that is an absolute fallacy. These are just the regular sayings that the opposition will throw out there to try to impede what we know needs to ultimately happen for the best thing for kids. And the status quo is very protective of power and control and resources. The reality is they continue to get a lot of resources, and they will do better with the resources when they actually have other examples to compare themselves to. And that's been shown in more than one study in Florida. In the districts where the highest percentage of children are going to schools other than their assigned public school, the children overall, the achievement levels of all the kids in that district have continued to improve. And I would argue it's because, first of all, the kids for whom their assigned school isn't working have found a better option that is working. And for the kids who stay in the assigned school, the school is actually making changes and adjustments that they refuse to make without those comparisons and without the threat of kids leaving their school. Competition works. Competition makes everyone better. It works in every other area of life. It needs to work and it needs to happen in our K-12 system if we hope to have a rising generation that's going to be prepared to lead in the future.
The arguments against school choice and education freedom always seem to me to boil down to trust. We don't trust parents. We don't trust other people to know what's better for their children. We, an elite who've been super educated, know what's best for families. How fundamentally do you respond to that presumption that they know better than American parents?
Well, I think it's terribly offensive. And, I've met hundreds and hundreds of kids over the years, and in many cases their parents who have, through small programs in states, whether they were privately funded or publicly funded, who've had the opportunity to make a choice other than their assigned school, and the trajectory for their lives has been fundamentally changed. To presume that a poor parent cannot make a good decision for his or her child is an absolute affront to that parent, and it's, I think, broadly an affront to our humanity. It is inconceivable to me that anyone could think that those who are highly educated, elite, can make a better decision for a child they don't personally know, they don't personally love, than a parent who loves his or her child. And this is just a false argument that I think needs to be beaten immediately.
We're going to do 2 or 3 more.
And I would just say, there was a state legislator in Georgia just this week, I believe, who made just that statement in a hearing and is getting a lot of feedback on that parents who didn't, graduate high school can't make a good decision for their child. I think this is just abominable, and again, I think that that argument needs to just be defeated promptly.
We'll do 2 or 3 more topics, and then I'll open it up to questions. I know there are lots of people with questions they wanted to ask. I wanted to turn our attention briefly, if I may, to higher education. We talk a lot about what's gone wrong in schooling, but if you look at how certain publicly funded universities are now run, they're almost sort of factories for this divisive ideology, this divisive idea that Americans should almost see each other not as individuals, but as part of a collective group. It's very, very damaging and divisive. What do you recommend in your book that we should do to change the universities, to tackle some of this?
Well, it's not only publicly funded universities, it's also private universities and colleges that are really tilting in this direction. And I think, I think higher education is in for a real revolution. I'm hopeful that some of the reforms we put into place while in office are going to encourage more supply in the higher education marketplace through, the accreditors have been the gatekeepers in many regards to who can or who cannot participate as offerers of higher education. We changed that so that there's going to be a much more competitive marketplace in regards to accreditation. I think states also have to do their part in that triad of the federal, Department of Education, accreditors, and states. States are the authorizers for public institutions, as you know, and they need to step up and take responsibility for ensuring that their public institutions are not drifting off into unconstitutional areas where they're not allowing open and free exchange of ideas on campus and just embracing the far left wokeism and all of the other acronyms that fall under that. But I think that the way that we're going to ultimately ensure that higher education returns to its original goals is by having other providers. And I am encouraged by the private sector, industries that are stepping up and saying, we know that not all kids can or should go to college, yet they need something beyond college or beyond high school, a certificate or a short-term program of some sort. I think there's great opportunity for the private sector to step in ways and partner with local high schools and or other institutions to provide alternate pathways. That was something that we really advocated very broadly for in the last administration, and one which we see this administration basically turning its back on in many ways. But there's ample opportunities to strengthen the other pathways and encourage students to be very discerning about whether a four-year college or university is the right thing for them to do after high school.
A big part of the problem with universities seems to be accreditation and tenure. Tenure allows fairly mediocre woke academics to sit there and not do much and teach sort of fairly mediocre courses and do it on our dollar. Florida's attempted to tackle this. Should we be trying to impose similar legislation on Ole Miss and Mississippi State that Florida has now imposed on its universities?
Well, I think it certainly merits some close attention to see if some of those provisions are ones that should be emulated elsewhere. I think that states really reasserting their role in assuring what their higher ed institutions are actually offering is, again, an important part of that triad. Again, the accreditors have gained far too much control and far too much influence in this. There's more than one way to attack that. Our regulations have started to, but states have a role to play in that, and that would be a good area to examine too.
Now, Cal mentioned this in his opening remarks. We had Riley Gaines. She is the most articulate 22-year-old I've ever met. She is not a professional communicator, but she's probably the most effective communicator I've listened to. She was extraordinarily compelling in her story, and Riley Gaines' story is an extraordinary story. She spent hours and years and months becoming the best swimmer in her class in America. And she was denied a gold medal because a cheat was allowed, who was a man, was allowed to say that he was a woman and compete against her. Even then, actually, she wasn't actually beaten by him. They tied, something that's very rare. And she's now going around talking about the need to defend women's sports and particularly fix Title IX. Now, I know you've been very involved in this. Would you like to talk a little bit about this?
Certainly. Well, and I have a whole chapter in the book about what we did with Title IX and regulation around that, because if you think back to the Obama-Biden administration, where they sent out a Dear Colleague letter to every educational institution and said, this is how you are to handle matters of sexual misconduct on campus, and basically did away with due process and essentially set up kangaroo courts across the country, negatively impacting hundreds and hundreds of young people. We set about to correct that, and in the process of doing that, did rulemaking, which has the force of law, and made the framework for that a very fair and balanced approach, respecting both those who have been wronged and those who have been accused of wrong, giving them rights to make their case and to get to the truth. Long story short, the continuation of the Obama administration in the Biden administration sees the same individual who headed the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education back in that role again, and this time undoing the work that we did and going multiple steps further if the rule is anything like the draft. Their rule will do away again with due process. It will set up a single investigator model for matters of misconduct, if they're brought to this investigator, the individual can be the investigator, the judge, the jury, and then the individual who actually sees the, whatever is the judgment play out. This is an absolutely indefensible approach, in my view. Secondly, they have taken the definition of biological sex, which all of us recognize as male and female, and have added to it gender identity and basically anything else you decide you want to be at any given point in time, which in my view, and lots of legal minds far smarter than me have said it essentially makes the Title IX law a moot point. If you allow biological males to compete on female teams and against females, which Title IX was passed to actually allow women the equal access to that, to education and education activities, it can't be both. And so this is a very, very current example around that. And I would just add, I was a swimmer myself. I swam competitively for 9 years. There is no way I would have gone to 7:30 a.m. swim practice in a cold swimming pool all of those mornings if I knew I was going to have to compete not only against really great female swimmers, but against biological males as well. I mean, this would just be the biggest wet blanket over women's sports that you could possibly imagine.
The Biden administration doesn't just seem to want to allow people to redefine themselves on a whim. It almost revels in this. Kamala Harris the other day, I saw on social media, had written somebody a letter congratulating them for being a woman, despite the fact they're born as a man. They almost seem to relish doing it. Where does this come from? I can't imagine Jimmy Carter's Democrat Party or even Bill Clinton's Democrat Party going along with this. Where does this come from?
Well, I can't actually answer that myself. Other than that, I'm constantly like dumbfounded by the things that are happening in the most even unsuspecting places that reaffirm this attitude. And I mean, it is like worse than whack-a-mole right now. It's you everywhere you think you might have gotten something exposed and sort of under control or back in the hands of sane thinking people, you have 3 other incidents pop up that are equally as egregious. I mean, this is the far leftist of left have taken over the Democrat Party, and I think it's a real opportunity for those of us who are Republicans to attract individuals to support our candidates and our platforms if we do it right.
One of the great secrets of America's success is this principle that all Americans are created equal, that everyone, however imperfectly that may have sometimes been applied, that in principle everyone is equal. Critical race theory actually teaches Americans a very different idea. This is the idea that you are a victim and that there's a hierarchy of victimhood, and that far from being equal, you need state intervention to compensate for alleged wrongdoing. Now, critical race theory is very, very divisive. We here in Mississippi passed a bill last year to try to combat this, but I'll be honest, it was quite difficult for us to do it, because when you sit down and you figure out how we're going to pass the law to combat this, you can't, as a conservative, ban ideas. You can't ban books. You can't try and behave like a communist might. So the best we could come up with is to try to say that public money couldn't be used to compel students to believe some Americans were superior or inferior based upon immutable characteristics. And I like to think that Martin Luther King, when he talked about an America where his children will grow up and be judged on the content of their character rather than color of skin, I rather like to think our bill was consistent with that. But I have to say, it seems that that kind of legislation is not enough. What role is education reform going to have in combating these ideas?
Well, I would agree, and first of all, congratulations for tackling that issue and for really attempting to expose what has been going on, and to roll back all of those efforts to infiltrate all of our kids' educations. But you're right. You can't ban ideas, and you can't tell people how to think. What you can do is ensure that families because let's be honest. I mean, this view of victims and oppressors, and the state has to resolve every issue, is in itself a faith, a religion. And so when we say that schools are supposed to be places of not having a philosophy or a religious bent, the reality is they do. I mean, secularism is the religion of most of these folks who see the state and the government as the answer and the policeman for all of the ideology that they want to try to impose on everyone else. So the reality is that the only way to ultimately, I believe, ensure that all families' perspectives are honored and respected, and that their ability to worship and live as they choose and please is to allow for them to make those choices through education freedom. And let me just say a word about education freedom versus school choice. I know that the term school choice has been used for a long, long time. I actually adopted the phrase education freedom several years ago because I think it helps us think more broadly about what education can and should look like. When you say school choice, you immediately think of a building. You immediately think of sort of the system that we've been operating under. And I don't think that that's how it has to look in the longer term. Yes, there will still be schools and school buildings, but you'll also have different iterations and different experiences for young people. I think about a little school in the western part of Michigan where I live, and those of you who've been to Michigan know that it's getting a little nicer this time of year, but December, January, February, very cold, lots of snow. This little school, elementary school, is an outdoor school. The kids go to school outdoors every day, all day, year round. They don't have a school building. They have a couple of little huts they go in to warm up and check in with their advisor. But this is a totally different approach to a K-12 experience. And I use that just as an example to say, we have to think more broadly about what learning and education can and should look like. And education freedom policies are the way that we're going to combat bad ideas or make sure that there's a free exchange of ideas rather than being subject to one ideology and philosophy.
Wonderful. Well, it's been wonderful. Thank you so much. We're going to have we've got about 10 minutes for questions. So I'm going to pick on one or two people who I've prepped. But if anyone would also like to put their hand up, I'll come to you as well. Now, Artie, I know you had a question. Did you want to?
Yeah. Mrs. DeVos, thank you for being here today, and thank you for speaking with us. You mentioned about the importance of competition between schools, how it improves schools, and I was saying most of us believe that in our everyday life, competition improves our lives, in our everyday purchases. Why do you think, could you try to explain why you think for so long we have accepted a government monopoly for our schools, for education, which is so important, and yet we would never think of accepting that when we go to the grocery store or to a restaurant? Why do you think we've accepted it?
Well, I think, again, I think the founding of our K-12 education system was very well intentioned, but I think that those who have been a part of protecting that system and growing the power of that system have been very intent and very intentional on doing just that. And it's kind of like the frog in the pot of water. The water's just gotten hotter and hotter and hotter, and those of us that have been in the water maybe didn't realize it was time to jump out of that water. And I think we also get this romanticized notion of what public education is. It does not have to mean a government-run school. I would contend the better definition for public education is any educational experience that prepares every single child in our country to be effective contributors as adults. And you know, we've gotten all caught up on what kind of school. It's charter school, home school, private school, faith-based school, virtual school, magnet school, you name it. We've gotten caught up on those adjectives and lost sight of what education, K-12 education really is, and it needs to be the preparation of of unlocking every single child's potential, which is not done exclusively through a top-down, monopolistic, government-run system. Think about public education being any kind of education that prepares the public.
Any hands up for any questions you wanted to ask? Warren.
As we find ourselves in conversation with family and friends, some may not be fully aware of education freedom and what our options are. Some of them may be against it. Do you have an elevator pitch that you would recommend to all of us as we leave here and have conversations with people?
Well, I think the simplest elevator pitch is basically empower parents to choose the right education for their children. No matter their income, no matter their, home location, no matter their state. Of course, it has to be done state by state because these are state laws. But empower parents to make those choices. Don't cede that responsibility to a top-down government approach.
There's a hand up over there, the lady there.
Yes, this is actually less of a school choice issue, but more to your point on this should be more of a state and local issue. It's my understanding some groups are saying that the school boards on the local level, there's a lot of advocacy from the left to place these school board members, and it's kind of like a bottom-up approach as well. From the left, what is your opinion of that, and how should the conservative education policymakers really pay attention to those local races? So while we're still pushing for school choice, the current school system, what are your thoughts?
Sure. Well, it is true that school board elections, school boards have been very much a part of the whole ecosystem of the protection of the status quo. Because I don't know how it is exactly in Mississippi, but in my state of Michigan, school board elections are always held at a very innocuous time that nobody knows about. Nobody knows who the candidates are because they're all handpicked by the insiders, and they're automatically elected. Now, I think another great result of this parental awakening is the involvement in school board races and the changing of many school boards. This is good and important, but it's not going to ultimately solve the problem of the monopolistic one-size-fits-all system. It's still going, the school boards are still going to be part of the same system that we've known for 175 years. It will be a good change, but the only way to fundamentally change the overall dynamic is by really placing the parents in control of those resources instead of putting those resources directly into the system.
I think we've got time for 2 more questions, and the chairman's prerogative. I see Cal wants to take one of them.
We're a small organization, Mississippi Center for Public Policy. We've got limited funds. Teachers' unions that you talked about are well-funded, they're well-organized. They fight in a dirty arena. They'll stop at nothing. Sorry why, but a lot of times they have the media in their corner. Where would you tell us we could get the most bang for a buck with what we're trying to do
Well, I think start with the parent organizations that have organically been forming as a result of the experiences parents navigated through COVID. There's a lot of them, ladies and gentlemen in the room who are part of parents organizations, just raise your hand and let them know who is involved in some of these grassroots organizations. Come alongside, support their efforts to really be voices at the grassroots level. And then importantly, talk to your legislators and keep talking to your legislators and invite them, if they're skeptical, invite them to visit schools that are working, that are not part of the government-run system. Invite them to to have conversation about what their reluctance is and give them the arguments against them. Again, I don't want to pitch my book too much, but I will. It really is a playbook for both parents and policymakers to talk about and think about these issues and to dispel the opposition. If you're not really fundamentally part of that system, you got to be with the parents. 75 to 80% of parents, no matter what, how you cut it, are in favor of education freedom policies. We've never had that kind of support around that in this country before. It doesn't matter what state you're in, it doesn't matter what ethnicity you are, what socioeconomic level, 75 to 80%. And so this is the time to really advance the policies that are ultimately going to make all schools better. Because at the core, this isn't about like hurting public schools. It's about helping kids, and it will ultimately help public schools get better in the process.
Thanks for that. Now there's a gentleman next to you, Greg.
Ms. DeVos, thank you for your service to the country. I just have one question. You mentioned Arkansas, Virginia, and Florida, all of which are in the southern part of the United States. Without the access to the major media outlets, which we do not have, I'm wondering if, I don't know, is this message getting across in the Midwest and other parts of the country as it is in the South?
Well, thanks for that question. It is. I mean, this is really, I would say, a nationwide conversation with parents rising up to say, we don't like what's been going on and we want change. I mean, it's happening in states like California and New York, and it should happen even more in New York. After this week, the New York Board of Education decided to dumb down their expectations for students even further. They have decided, taking the scores that students achieved in 2022 after all of the COVID learning loss, they're now lowering all of the expectation or the levels for proficiency to the 2022 levels. So what you're saying to kids is, we know you're behind, but that's okay. We don't expect that you're going to be able to catch up or learn what you need to learn in the 13 years you're in K-12 education. We're going to just keep lowering the bar, lowering expectations, and pretend that everything's going to be okay. I mean, so parents all over the place have finally realized, the ploy that that the status quo has been feeding us for a lot of years, and they're rising up all over the place. Pennsylvania, Ohio and Indiana have both had major programs for a lot of years. They're both poised to dramatically expand their programs as well in this legislative session.
Mrs. DeVos, thank you. Thank you for coming to Jackson. Thank you for taking the time to so eloquently explain your ideas. Thank you for writing such a brilliant book. But thank you most of all for your service to America. I think what you are doing is going to transform America for the better, and it's because of your passion and commitment that I think we're going to see change. So thank you for all that you've done and are doing.
Well, thank you, Douglas. Thank you, all of you who are supporting this organization. You are doing important work, and I look forward to what Mississippi is going to do in the coming months to really support families and kids in our future. Thank you.